In the middle of a gray Montana winter, a woman is mistakenly sent to a strange ranch facing a man whose pain cannot be named. And behind her, a child whispers the words that change their lives. God finally sent you to us. But behind that whisper is the secret of a missing wife, a child who has lost his voice, and a man from the past who is quietly returning. If it were you, faced with a broken family and a child's silent cry for help, would you choose to leave to protect yourself or stay to heal others? Do you have the courage to face pain that isn't yours, just because your heart tells you that someone needs you? Today's story is a journey of choices, of buried memories, and of love that comes at the right time. If that touches you, stay with me. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join this emotional story. The dirt road that led through Silver Creek in late winter always had a strange beauty. Many said it was beautiful in a cruel way, like a part of life that everyone had to go through, even though they knew in advance that it would be cold enough to numb the soul. On that road that morning, a woman walked alone. Her steps were slow but not weak. Her thick coat was wrapped tightly around her body, a woolen scarf wrapped around her neck. The snow was falling so thickly that only white patches could be seen against the sky. Her name was Miriam Carter, 38 years old. No longer young and no longer expecting much from sudden changes in life. But that morning she was on her way to make a choice that she herself probably didn't understand why she had the courage to take. The west wind whipped at her face in harsh gusts. The snowflakes stung her cheeks like needles. Miriam pulled her coat tight, stepping carefully through the snow that had already covered more than 2 inches. The route from the stagecoach station to the ranch, as the marriage agency letter had directed, should not have been so far. But the storm had come sooner than expected, and all she was left with was the feeling that she was walking into a foreign land. She whispered in a thin breath, "Just find the right address. Just get there. And everything will be different." But her heart wasn't sure of that. The letter from the Montana matrimonial agency said that a man named Andrew Carter had chosen her. A quiet farmer with a small farm. The similarity of their names seemed to her like a beautiful sign of fate. It had taken Miriam years to muster the determination to leave the East, leave her shattered memories and start anew in the vast West. But when she passed the last of the birch trees and saw the ranch ahead, the first thing she noticed was something was wrong. The house was much larger than the letter had described. There was no sign that it belonged to Andrew Carter. More importantly, the house stood in the snowstorm like a stubborn shadow from the past, silent, heavy, and so cold that Miriam felt as if she were knocking on the door of a memory that was not her own. She approached slowly. The wind still caught her skirts, pulled at her scarf as if to restrain her or to push her away. Miriam raised her hand and knocked on the door. The door opens at the first touch. The man standing there made her stop involuntarily. Jonas Mercer, 45 years old. Tall, broad-shouldered, the typical figure of a man who has devoted his life to horses, the steppe, and winters that last more than half the year. His face is marked by experience. His gray eyes are cold but not emotionless, as if they have seen too many things that he cannot find a way to say. He looked her up and down, not with a scrutinizing gaze, but with a look of surprise and wariness, as if her presence had disturbed something he had tried to keep quiet for years. "What do you need here?" he asked, his voice low, slightly hoarse, with a distinctive southern accent. Miriam took a deep breath, regaining her composure. "I am Miriam Carter. I have been sent to be married to Mr. Andrew Carter. The instructions took me to this address." Jonas stood still. The wind blew harder, but he did not move. "You've come to the wrong ranch," he said slowly. "There's no Andrew Carter here. This is Silver Creek Ranch, and I didn't order a bride." In that moment, Miriam felt herself freeze, not because of the wind, but because of the vague fear that once again she was in the wrong place at the wrong time in the wrong life. She tried to keep her voice calm. There might have been a mistake in the mail. "But, please, the blizzard is intensifying. I can't go back to town right now." Jonas looked out. The storm had whitened his vision. He said nothing for a few seconds, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were struggling between duty and annoyance at her sudden appearance. Finally, he opened the door wider. "You can come in." But only temporarily. Miriam bowed her head in thanks. She stepped inside, where the warmth from the fireplace seemed to touch skin numbed by hours of frostbite. The space was large but cold in the way a home without people could be. Wooden tables and chairs, old kitchen cabinets, dark wood paneling. A place that had once been a true home but long since lost its laughter. She set the small bag on the floor and was about to take off her coat when a faint sound came from the stairs, soft as a cat's footsteps. So soft that Miriam wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Then, a small head appeared behind the wooden railing. A little girl, about 7 years old, shoulder-length, slightly curly hair, large light brown eyes, a look both clear and strangely sad. The child kept looking at Miriam. Miriam smiled softly. "Hello, child." There was no response. The child just walked down the stairs slowly, as if afraid to break the silence of the house. Then the baby stopped in front of Miriam, raised his head and looked deep into her eyes. The child reached out and gently touched the hem of Miriam's coat, squeezed it a little. Then whispered, her voice so low that if the house hadn't been so silent, Miriam wouldn't have heard. "God finally sent you to us." Jonas turned back immediately, his eyes filled with panic. But Lucy Mercer did not take her hands off Miriam's shirt. Miriam stood still. The words pierced every layer of her defense. Part of her wanted to believe it, and part of her trembled with fear that she had broken another heart. Jonas stepped forward, clearly confused. She hasn't spoken in 2 years. I don't know why. Miriam looked down at the child, clinging to her, her eyes sparkling as if she had found what she had been waiting for. She repeated in a voice as soft as the wind, "God sent me." Lucy nodded slightly. Jonas turned away, took a deep breath as if trying to keep his voice from shaking. He spoke, but so softly it sounded like a confession to himself. "She hasn't said a word since the night my wife died." Outside, the wind howled louder, sweeping through the wooden walls as if it wanted to sweep the whole house away. Inside, a lost woman stood still between the unfinished father and son, not knowing what she was about to walk into. But despite the confusion, the cold, the shivering, Miriam felt one thing clearly. This house was not just surrounded by a storm. It was covered with a pain greater than any snowstorm, and she just became the link that both father and son unconsciously held on to. She didn't know if it was the beginning of healing or the beginning of another event. But in the moment Lucy whispered those words, Miriam understood. There are paths that seem wrong but actually lead us to the right place. The first night at Silver Creek Ranch was inexplicably quiet. So quiet that Miriam felt if she dropped a needle, the sound would be enough to startle the whole house. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door in sharp knife-like gusts. Snow pattered against the windows in a steady rhythm, like the slow footsteps of someone who didn't want to leave but didn't dare stay. Jonas rekindled the fireplace. The flames were just starting, the soft orange light reflecting off the old wood, making the room seem less deserted. Miriam stood nearby, her hands clutching the hem of her coat as if to retain the last bit of warmth in her body. Lucy sat on the wooden chair, her small legs swinging slightly, her eyes following Miriam as if she might disappear at any moment. Jonas put 2 more large logs on the fire, stood up and brushed the dust off his hands. "You can leave your coat here. The house is cold, but at least it will be dry." Miriam nodded. "Thank you for letting me in. I know it wasn't easy." Jonas did not answer at once. He looked out the window where the snow continued to fall in sheets. After a long while he said, "It is not easy, but leaving a man outside in a storm like this is even harder." His voice held something like responsibility, or maybe a confession that he still cared for someone, even if that care was locked away deep inside. Miriam dropped her coat on a chair and paced around the room. This was certainly no place for a stranger, but it had once been a family home. Small objects were scattered like fragments of unfinished memories, an unfinished embroidery on the table, a small flower-printed cup with a chipped rim, a broken music box askew on a shelf, a family photograph in a wooden frame. Miriam paused on the photograph. The woman in it had gentle eyes, a round face, and a smile so gentle that one wanted to believe the Montana sky had never known dark clouds. Miriam looked closely at those eyes. Then she turned and met Jonas's gaze following her. His gaze was downcast, as if something had just been recalled. She asked softly, "Is that your wife?" Jonas nodded. "Evelyn. She died 2 years ago." The air in the room seemed to stand still for a moment. Lucy stopped swinging her legs. She clasped her hands together, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miriam felt as if she had stepped on an open wound. She started to apologize, but Jonas had already turned away as if he were used to people not knowing what to say to such news. He pointed down the hall. "Your room is at the end of the hall. There's hot water in the basin. I'll light the fire in there." Miriam nodded slightly. "I know I came at the wrong time, the wrong place, but thank you for your kindness." Jonas paused slightly at the words, then turned away as if to escape her gaze. Lucy was different. She stood up wordlessly but moved closer to Miriam. She reached out and touched Miriam's fingers with her tiny hand so lightly that Miriam felt it as if it were a breeze. The gesture was simple, but it carried a strange weight. It was as if Lucy were giving her the first trust in a long time. Miriam bent down and asked softly, "Do you want to follow me?" Lucy neither nodded nor shook her head. She held Miriam's hand a moment longer, then suddenly let go and sat back down in her chair. But her eyes never left hers. Jonas went ahead with the oil lamp illuminating the long, weather-beaten wooden hallway. Miriam followed. The sound of their boots echoed softly on the floor, enough to break the silence, but not enough to make the house less lonely. He opened the door of the last room. "You can stay here for now. The wind is strong tonight. You can hear the door shaking. Not unusual." Miriam nodded slightly. "I understand." Jonas turned, started to leave, then stood still for a few seconds as if he wanted to say something but held back. He just put the lamp down on the table and said, "If you need anything, just call." "Even at night?" Miriam asked. "Especially at night," he replied, his voice low and sincere. Then he left. Miriam sat down by the small fireplace. The warmth spread, but not enough to dispel the emptiness that came when the door closed. She placed her hands on her knees and stared into the flickering flames. In the sound of the wind whistling outside the door, she heard Lucy's words again in her head, "God finally sent you to us." The sentence echoed like a small, sad but warm song. But Miriam knew what makes a 7-year-old not speak for 2 years, what makes her eyes so full of adult sadness, and what makes Jonas Mercer live in a house that smells of the dead but has not been repaired. At that moment, Miriam realized that a strange fear was rising inside her. Not of Jonas, not of Lucy, and certainly not of the storm, but of fate actually pulling her into the lives of these strangers. A life she wasn't sure she had the strength to enter. But then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had come a long way to get here. She had suffered enough loss to know that every chance, no matter how small, was worth taking. A light knock sounded at the door. Miriam opened the door. Lucy stood there holding a woolen blanket. She didn't speak, but offered it to her with an irresistible look in her eyes. Miriam said softly, "Thank you." Lucy touched Miriam's hand once more, then turned away. But before she reached the end of the hallway, she looked back so deeply that Miriam felt Lucy saw the pain she had left unsaid. The door closed softly. The first night at Silver Creek Ranch officially begins. But in that deep silence, Miriam knew one thing for sure. There are silences, not to hide fear, but to keep a nascent hope. And she felt in some inexplicable way that she had not come to the wrong place. The morning at Silver Creek Ranch began with a pale sun hidden behind thick clouds. The night snowstorm had not dissipated, but instead continued to pile on new layers of white. As Miriam stepped out of the living room, the wind whistled steadily through the cracks in the door, a reminder that the world outside was not yet ready to let anyone in. She put on her coat and walked softly down the stairs. The smell of last night's coffee still lingered in the air. Jonas was leaning against the stove, holding a hot cup in both hands, his eyes sleepless but strangely alert. He looked out the window like a man who had spent years watching the weather instead of talking to people. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, her feet dangling off the floor, her arms wrapped around a plush doll. The little version of her was like her owner, silent, well-behaved, and somehow so sad that adults hesitated to look at her directly. As Miriam entered, Lucy raised her head. She did not smile, but her eyes were bright like a small fire rekindled on a gloomy winter day. Jonas spoke first. "The road is blocked. It will take at least 2 days to clear. You can't go anywhere for now." His voice still had that western edge to it, but it was less distant. Miriam nodded slightly. "I understand. I won't cause you any trouble." "Or Lucy." Jonas replied simply, "You haven't caused any trouble." The sentence was too short to convey her true feelings, but it was enough to make Miriam feel a little better. She moved closer to the stove and warmed her hands. Lucy set the doll down on the table, pulled a chair next to Miriam, and then leaned her head to touch her hand lightly as if it were something she had done long ago. A different warmth spread through Miriam's heart, a feeling she never thought she would experience again. The morning passed with the odd chores Miriam found to keep her hands from shaking and her heart from wavering. She found one of Lucy's little jackets torn at the shoulder, the needle long gone. Miriam sat by the window meticulously sewing each seam. The dim light on her hands showed the traces of years of labor, of storms she had never fully told anyone. Jonas stood on the porch trying to clear the path, knowing it was useless. He pushed the snow aside, but each time he cleared it, the wind whipped it back again. Yet he kept going, as is the habit of a man who does not know whether to stop because of pain or fatigue. Every now and then he would glance into the house and catch sight of Miriam busy sewing. Jonas would look for a moment, then look away. But that hesitation said more than any words. As for Lucy, she didn't want to leave Miriam's side. She stood by the chair, her chin resting on the table, her eyes intently watching Miriam's every move, as if she were trying to memorize every stitch. Miriam reached out and stroked her daughter's hair. "Do you want to learn to sew?" Lucy did not reply. She just touched Miriam's wrist lightly, then nodded slightly. The gesture made Miriam smile, a rare smile, a little shaky but genuine. At noon, Jonas brought in a bag of dry wood from the stables. Wet snow clung to his shoulders. Miriam stood up to help him hang his thick coat on the wooden rack. When they were so close, Jonas looked her in the eye for the first time. It wasn't a cold look anymore, but a look that was hard to describe, as if he were trying to remember how long it had been since he had looked at anyone that way. The two stood still for a few seconds. Then Jonas turned away, breathing softly as if trying to hide something. "You don't need help. This kind of work is not for women," Jonas said, his voice softer than usual. "I'm used to it," Miriam replied. "Women in the West do more heavy lifting than men. People just don't notice." Jonas let out a small gasp that was closer to a laugh than any sound she had ever heard from him. "Miriam Carter, you are unlike anyone I have ever met." Is that a compliment or a warning, perhaps? Both. It was a brief conversation, but Miriam realized it felt like the first step of something unspeakable. In the afternoon, the storm intensified. The wind shook the roof in gusts. Jonas went from room to room, checking the windows and closing the slats, while Miriam cooked a simple stew. The aroma filled the kitchen, making the air less cold and dreary. Lucy sat beside him, holding a small wooden spoon, stirring in the way a child always imitates someone it trusts. As Miriam was serving food, she heard Jonas say from behind her, "I don't remember the last time the house smelled like that." Miriam paused. "You and Lucy don't cook, yes. But..." Jonas looked into the space in front of him, his voice low. "Not like this." The words made Miriam understand that the meal wasn't what he was talking about. What he had been missing for the past 2 years was life. The real warmth of a family meal. They sat down at the table. Not much was said. There was only the sound of the wind and the sound of spoons hitting bowls. Lucy sat in the middle, eating slowly, occasionally glancing at Miriam, then at her father, as if keeping an eye on them both. The simple meal, just a few potatoes, some beef, and stale bread, was warming in a way that even a large feast could not be. As the afternoon wore on, the air in the house turned a deep yellow. Miriam was folding Lucy's finished shirt when Jonas entered. He stood in the doorway of the living room, silent for a moment. "Miriam," he said softly, using her name deliberately for the first time. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He took a deep breath, as if weighing his words. "I know you didn't come here to get involved in my family's affairs. But if you're planning on staying a few days until the storm passes, I hope that doesn't make things awkward for you." Miriam looked at him, tilting her head slightly. "Are you worried about me or yourself, Jonas Mercer?" He paused. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if searching for a place to hide his emotions. Jonas paused. "Little Lucy, she hasn't spoken in 2 years. And this morning, she spoke. To you. I thought it meant something." Miriam was silent. No one said anything for a few seconds. Only the wind rustled across the roof like a sigh from the steppe. Finally, Miriam spoke up. "I don't know what I can do to help, but if my presence will make Lucy less afraid, then I'll stay until the road is clear." Jonas nodded, his voice low. "Thank you." His thank you was not polite. It was like something difficult he had been holding back for a long time. That night, Lucy knocked gently on Miriam's door, carrying the rag doll. She said nothing, just stood there with expectant eyes. Miriam opened the door and leaned down. "Do you want to sleep here tonight?" Lucy nodded. Miriam took Lucy by the hand and led her into the room. The bed was small but warm. Miriam lay beside Lucy, the two of them covered under the same woolen blanket. Miriam could hear the baby's steady breathing, light but full of life. In the darkness, Miriam opened her eyes and looked up at the old wooden ceiling. She didn't understand why she didn't feel alienated. Maybe it was because the silence of Silver Creek Ranch was different from any silence she had ever known. It didn't want to swallow her. It was waiting for her. And when Lucy suddenly took her hand in her sleep, Miriam knew a bond had begun to form, quiet but enduring, as the snow gradually covered the meadow. The second night at Silver Creek Ranch ended like that, warmer, deeper, and far more dangerous to her heart than the storm outside. The third morning at Silver Creek Ranch opened with the sky gray, a gray so thick it looked like snow and clouds had blended together. From Miriam's window, the sky and earth could be seen in a blanket of white that stretched for miles. But the special thing about this morning was, it didn't have the chest-crushing coldness of the first, perhaps because of the sound of small footsteps approaching her room. The door opened very slightly, and Lucy's little head poked in. She held the rag doll to her chest, her eyes watching Miriam as if afraid she would disappear into the night. Miriam smiled, her voice soft as warmth. "Good morning, Lucy." The girl didn't answer, just walked in, handing the doll to Miriam as a gesture of sharing a part of her world. Miriam took it gently, stroking the doll's frayed hair, a small, pitiful thing stubbornly clinging to existence, like Lucy herself, like Miriam in a way. Jonas appeared a moment later, standing in the doorway of the living room, his hands on the doorframe as if he were hesitating whether to enter or not. He had a habit of standing like that when he was unsure of his emotions. Miriam was beginning to notice this. "Are you okay?" Jonas asked. "Fine. I don't think it's as cold today as it was yesterday. You're getting used to the West quickly." Miriam chuckled. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." Jonas looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. "It's a compliment. Breakfast that morning was just toast, eggs, and a little bacon, but it tasted better than any meal Miriam had had in months." Lucy sat next to her, glancing over every now and then to check if Miriam was still there. After the meal, Miriam decided to clean up the kitchen. Jonas looked at her, frowning. "You don't have to. Guests don't have to work." Miriam wiped the table, still maintaining her calm demeanor. "I am not a guest. I also do not want to sit still while you do all that." Jonas wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. He just leaned against the table, watching Miriam move around the kitchen with a calm familiarity. As if she had been here longer than a few days, as if her presence did not upset the order of the house but rather brought it back into balance. Lucy twisted the corner of her dress and handed Miriam a small piece of paper. Miriam unfolded it. There were only 4 words scribbled on it: "Stay with me." Miriam said nothing, but her chest tightened. By noon, the storm had not abated. Jonas needed to go to the stables to check on the cattle as the strong winds threatened to blow down the fence behind them. Miriam offered to come with him. Jonas protested immediately. "No. The wind is too strong. You'll be safer inside." But Miriam stood in the doorway, already in her coat. "You think I haven't been through a hurricane in the East? I can walk. I just want to help." Jonas looked at her for a long time. There was the confusion in his gaze of a man who had not had anyone come into his life so naturally for a long time. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Okay. But you have to stay close to me." The wind outside was so strong that the door rattled as Jonas opened it. Snow whipped at her face, but Miriam kept her step on the path he had laid out. Along the way, she could hear the wind whistling through the fence posts and the whitewashed grass. The vastness of the space around her made one feel small, but there was something liberating about it. "When I was little," Miriam said into the wind, "my father said blizzards were a test of who could keep their cool. The one who panics gets lost first." Jonas glanced at her. "You are not a person who panics easily." Miriam laughed softly. "I was scared, but I knew how to hide it." Jonas looked at her as if to say he understood the feeling better than anyone, but he said nothing. Western men often hid their pain in the saddle and the wind. When it mattered, they kept silent. As the afternoon wore on, the storm continued. The fireplace burned red hot, spreading warmth throughout the room. Miriam and Lucy sat together on the rug, working on a jigsaw puzzle with the small wooden pieces Jonas had made the year before. Lucy wrote on a piece of paper and pushed it toward Miriam. "You look like your mother," Miriam started. "Like my mother?" she asked softly. Lucy nodded. Her eyes were sparkling with tears. Miriam pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her small body. I don't want to replace anyone, but if you need me, I can be someone you can lean on. Lucy nestled into her shoulder, taking the initiative to hug Miriam with both arms for the first time. In that moment, Miriam felt her heart open, even though she knew it meant she was also more vulnerable. Jonas stood in the doorway watching the scene silently. He didn't enter, just looked, but there was something clear in his eyes: gratitude, relief, and a fear that Miriam would leave when the storm passed. As night fell, Miriam sat alone by the fireplace. Jonas sat opposite the old wooden table between them. It had been a long time since the house had heard voices, had felt warmth. Miriam, Jonas said slowly, "What are your plans?" "After the road is clear." Miriam was silent for a moment. She turned the cup over in her hands, the heat warming her palms. "I'm not sure," she said. "I hoped where I came from was the place for me. But maybe I was wrong." Jonas took a deep breath. "Is anyone waiting for you there?" Miriam looked into the fire. "There is only the name and the letter. But he is clearly not here." Jonas was about to say something, but just then, there was a sound of something falling from the kitchen. Lucy ran over, her face pale, holding another piece of paper. She handed it to Miriam. The words were written in shaky handwriting. "That night, it wasn't Dad." Miriam looked up at Jonas. He stood motionless, his face showing the old pain, as if someone had just ripped it open. The storm outside was still howling, but Miriam had the feeling the real storm was starting inside this house. The note Lucy had given Miriam was still in her hand long after she had run to Jonas. The trembling words, "That night, not father," were like a cut, not deep, but wide, touching a dark corner of the house Miriam had never seen. Jonas stood by the table, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. Miriam looked at him. Jonas bowed his head, breathing heavily, as if Lucy had touched a pain he had buried under the snow for 2 years. He did not speak, did not explain, did not deny. He just stood still, so still that Miriam could hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Lucy stood between the two, clutching the edge of Miriam's dress, her eyes so worried that the room seemed to shrink. Miriam gently took Lucy's hand. "You wrote this sentence. Do you remember?" Something Lucy did not answer. Her eyes only glanced at Jonas. Then she bowed her head quickly, as if afraid she would say something the adults would consider wrong. Jonas put his hand on his daughter's shoulder, but the hesitation in his movement suggested he was unsure if he still had the right to do so. "Lucy," he said softly, "you don't need to think about it again." The girl shook her head, hiding behind Miriam, clinging to her. And when Jonas saw it, a deep, choking pain flashed through his eyes. Miriam gently rubbed her back. "It's okay, Lucy. I just want to understand, so I can protect you." The words made Jonas look up, his gaze suddenly sharp, not from anger, but from the realization that Miriam had no intention of leaving them, at least not yet. That evening the wind outside was so strong it shook the windows. The storm had intensified. Snow blew through the cracks in the windows like white salt grains, pushing against every corner of the walls. Silver Creek Ranch shivered slightly with each gust, like a weary old man trying to hold on through a winter headache. Jonas sat silently in a chair facing the fire. Miriam sat on the rug near Lucy, adjusting her sweater. No one spoke for a long time. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was like the pause before a story that no one dared to begin. Finally, Jonas put the glass of water down on the table, his voice low and slow. "I know Lucy is remembering something. And I also know she is always scared to think about that night." Miriam looked at him, not urging, not interrupting. Her calmness made Jonas breathe easier, though he did not say so. He took a breath. "The night Evelyn disappeared, I was drunk. So drunk I can't remember much. There was blood on my sleeve. The back door was wide open. The baby was crying in the corner of the kitchen." His voice trailed off a little. "I don't know what happened. I don't know what I did. I just remember that morning. It felt like someone had taken the voice out of this house." Lucy crept quietly back beside Miriam, snuggling close to her as if afraid Jonas would say something she didn't want to hear. Jonas looked at the scene, and Miriam could see the familiar struggle in his eyes, wanting to get close but too afraid to hurt her further. Miriam asked softly, "Do you think you did something to your wife?" Jonas closed his eyes. "I don't know. I don't remember. And maybe that's what I'm most afraid of." The fire reflected off his face, revealing the weariness accumulated over the years. Miriam did not feel he was as dangerous as the rumors said. On the contrary, she saw him as a man caught between guilt and an unnamed truth. After a simple supper, Miriam tidied up the kitchen while Jonas took Lucy upstairs to bed. When he came back down, he stood looking out the window for a long time, his broad shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of winter on his back. "You may think I'm dangerous," he said without turning. "I don't blame you if you want to leave when the road is clear." Miriam stopped washing the dishes. "I don't think you're the one who hurt your wife." He was silent. The hand on the window frame clenched. "You don't know what kind of man I am." "If you were a bad man," Miriam replied, "Lucy wouldn't have run to hide behind you when the thunder broke out last night." Jonas turned back for the first time. His eyes softened, a flicker of something like hope, the kind of feeling that sometimes a well-timed word can bring back after years of being buried. "Lucy has reason to fear something," Miriam continued, "but I don't believe that reason is you." Jonas looked at her a long time. It seemed no one had said that to him since Evelyn had disappeared. He sat down in a chair near the fireplace, clasping his hands together. "Sometimes I think she's afraid of adults, afraid of memories, maybe afraid of me. And that makes me," he paused, "feel like I've failed." Miriam sat down beside him, not too close. "A failed father. Isn't he someone who admits he's wrong?" Jonas turned, his eyes flashing with gratitude. "You always say it in ways I don't expect." "Because I used to be," Miriam replied softly. "I used to believe I was unworthy of anyone's tenderness." Their eyes met, deep and honest, unstrained, undefended. While Jonas went to check the stables again, Miriam stayed behind to clean up Lucy's toys from the floor. By chance, she found a small notebook hidden under a sofa cushion. The first page was covered with thin pencil marks. Miriam opened. "Our drawings. No color. Just faint, shaky black lines. A house. A tall figure stood in front of the door. Another smaller figure fell to the ground. A child holding a doll stood behind the door. Right at the bottom corner of the page was Lucy's scribbled handwriting. Mama didn't leave us. She was taken." Miriam felt her heart sink. She looked toward the stairs where a small patch of light from Lucy's room fell. She didn't just remember, she witnessed. And that pain is still here in every trembling stroke. When Jonas returned, Miriam hid the notebook. Not to hide it from him, but to keep Lucy from feeling exposed. But Miriam knew they needed to talk about everything. She placed her hand gently on the table. "Jonas, I think Lucy is remembering little by little. And when she remembers enough, we will know the truth." Jonas stood there silent. "Do you believe me?" "Yes," said Miriam. "But I trust Lucy more." Outside, the storm howled like the spirit of the land. But for the first time since arriving at Silver Creek Ranch, Miriam felt as if she were where fate had called her. And in the heavy silence of the night, one thing was clear. The truth is at hand, and it won't be gentle with anyone. The next morning, the storm hadn't let up. Inches of snow had piling up in white drifts that blocked the trail down the hill. Silver Creek Ranch seemed buried in a white world cut off from the rest of Montana. Inside the house, though, something was changing, slowly but surely. Miriam woke up when Lucy quietly placed a hand on her arm. She looked at her with a look that was half worried, half relieved, as if she just wanted to make sure that Miriam was still here in this very room, in this very bed, not gone like the shadow that had disappeared on that snowy night 2 years ago. Miriam sat up, stroking her cheek. "I'm still here, Lucy." Lucy pressed her cheek to her hand, then climbed out of bed and placed the rag doll on Miriam's pillow, something she only did with someone she trusted completely. When Miriam went down to the kitchen, Jonas was there. He was sitting by the window, a cup of hot coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on the snow in the yard. Not to watch, as if waiting for something to appear in the distance. "Someone is watching the ranch," he said softly without turning his head. Miriam paused. "Did you see someone?" "Not exactly." Jonas put down his cup and stood up. "But there are new boot prints outside the north fence. Not mine. Not yours. And certainly not Lucy's." Lucy stopped in her tracks as she entered the kitchen, clutching her lapels when she heard that. Miriam looked over at the child, gently pulling Lucy into her arms. "It's okay. Whoever it is, we're all in the house." Jonas put on his coat and hat. "I need to double-check. The wind blew down part of the fence last night. If anyone's around, I need to know." Miriam stood up instinctively. I'll go too. Jonas turned back immediately, shaking his head. No, the wind is much stronger today than yesterday. It will be faster for me to go alone. And more dangerous, Miriam replied, her voice calm but unyielding. Jonas looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man used to carrying things alone and not easily letting others in. But in his eyes, Miriam saw the weariness of too many sleepless nights and the loneliness of a father afraid of hurting his daughter again. Finally, he sighed. Okay, but you have to stay close to me. Lucy stepped forward, clutching Jonas's hand, her eyes wide with worry. Miriam bent down, took him in her arms and whispered, I'm just going to see what's out there. I'll be back soon, Lucy. Lucy nodded slowly but didn't let go of Miriam's hand until Jonas opened the door. The wind outside was so strong it blew the hem of Miriam's thick coat sideways. The snow stung her face like needles. Jonas walked ahead, his stride strong and steady, accustomed to such cruel winters. Miriam followed close behind, each step requiring strength to keep from being blown back. The prints are north, Jonas said, his voice distorted by the wind. A little past the fence. As they approached the north fence, Miriam saw clear boot prints etched into the deep snow. It was no coincidence. Someone had definitely walked very close by. Maybe someone passing by, Miriam said. No, Jonas said, still scanning the ground. No one would pass through this area in a storm. And these boot prints. He bent down to examine them closely. Large. A grown man. The deep tread suggests he was carrying something heavy. Miriam felt a chill run down her spine, and not because of the snow. Jonas stood up straight, his eyes sharp as knives. Not Evelyn. Not me. Not a nomad. And certainly not someone who wandered here by accident. Miriam watched as the wind began to erase the boot prints. Though they would only last a few minutes before being buried under the snow, they were enough to tell that someone had come, and that someone wanted to leave no trace other than footsteps. Who do you think it is? Asked Miriam. Jonas looked away toward the pines. I think someone knows exactly what happened that night, and doesn't want the truth to come out. When they returned home, Lucy was standing in the doorway, clutching the doll, her eyes filled with fear. She ran to Miriam and grabbed her hand, as if she were waking from a nightmare. Jonas bent down and stroked her daughter's head, but Lucy only clung to Miriam more. Miriam stroked her hair. It's okay. We're okay. Lucy looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. She pulled Miriam close to her ear and whispered in a low, breathy voice. I heard footsteps last night. Miriam's heart stopped. Where, Lucy? The girl's hand shook as she pointed to the ceiling. In the attic. Jonas heard and turned around immediately. Are you sure? Lucy nodded. Quickly, fiercely, and fearfully. Jonas stood still for a few seconds, then headed for the stairs. Miriam started to follow, but Lucy grabbed her arm and shook her head. She was shaking so hard that Miriam could hear her gasp for breath. Lucy, do you want me here? The girl nodded vigorously. Miriam took her hand and led her into the living room, where she sat down beside the fireplace. Lucy sat on her lap, her head resting on Miriam's chest, her breath clinging to her coat. Miriam held her, patting her back as if soothing a troubled baby bird. Meanwhile, Jonas climbed the stairs to the attic. The wooden floorboards creaked under his feet. The wind whistled through the cracks in the roof, making a long, howling sound that sounded like someone calling his name. Jonas opened the attic door and the light flashed on, illuminating a deep, dark space filled with memories he never wanted to touch. He swept the light around the attic. No one was there. But when he stopped in the left corner, he saw some pale blue yarn caught on the nail of the door. That blue color. The color of the scarf Evelyn kept from many years ago. The scarf was missing the night she disappeared. Jonas stepped back, his heart pounding like a drum. And then he heard a small sound behind him, not wind, not a mouse. A light tap. Very faint, but enough to make him turn around immediately. Nobody. The floor in the right corner had very light footprints, as if someone had stood there and then left in a hurry. Jonas turned on the light and walked slowly down the stairs. When he returned to the living room, Miriam immediately looked at his face. Is anyone up there? Jonas shook his head. No. But there are signs that someone has been up there recently. Lucy hugged Miriam tighter, her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. Jonas sat down beside them for once, not keeping his distance. We'll lock the doors. No one's going up to the attic tonight. I'll keep watch. Miriam looked straight at him. Jonas, Someone is trying to scare us. And if Lucy heard the noise last night, we have to believe her. Jonas closed his eyes, his hands clenched. I believe. More than I admit. Miriam placed her hand on his as gently as if touching an invisible wound. We will find out the truth, Jonas. But first, we must keep Lucy safe. Lucy looked up at that, her eyes filled with tears, but there was something stronger than fear. She touched Miriam's face, looked deep into her eyes, and wrote on a small piece of paper, I believe you. And when Miriam read it, her heart trembled, not with fear, but because for the first time in years someone truly needed her. Completely. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the little house a silent vow was being made. Whatever the truth of that night was, they wouldn't let Lucy face it alone. That afternoon the storm didn't intensify, but it didn't break either. The sky hung like a gray blanket, trapping all the light. Silver Creek Ranch felt like a place suspended between two worlds, a snowy reality and another world where old secrets were slowly emerging from memories everyone wanted to forget. Miriam stood by the window, her eyes on the pale horizon. Her mind kept returning to the image of the shoe prints on the fence and the green wool in the attic. Those details, small as they were, touched her intuition, the intuition that had saved her from many impossible situations back east. Jonas was in the stable, checking on the cows, some of whom might have gotten chilled in the storm. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, drawing her head bowed as if trying to force her memories onto paper so she wouldn't have to keep them in her head. The house was silent except for the soft sound of pencil on paper. Miriam went up to her. What are you drawing, Lucy? Lucy bit her lip, hesitated, then pushed the paper toward Miriam. The drawing showed 3 people, 2 adults and a child. The 3 figures stood close together, their hands touching. But behind them, near the door of the house, there was a tall, dark figure, its outline rough and distorted like a mass of darkness ready to swallow up the light. Miriam looked closely, feeling a chill run down her spine. Lucy, where have you seen this person? Lucy shook her head. She took another piece of paper and wrote, I don't know. I just remember the silhouette. You remember from that night? Lucy nodded again. Miriam put her hand on her daughter's hair. Thank you for sharing. You did very well. Lucy looked up at her with sparkling eyes as if she were the only anchor keeping her steady against the terrifying memories. Late in the afternoon, Jonas returned. His coat was caked with mud and snow, and his breathing was heavy. Miriam realized he was hiding something. What's going on out there, she asked. Jonas did not answer immediately. He hung his coat on a hook, shook the snow off his shoulders, and then looked her straight in the eye. The back fence has signs of bending, not from the wind. Someone pulled it. For what? To get into the ranch, Jonas said slowly. But he didn't go into the stable. He didn't go into the barn. He just stood there for a moment, and then he left. Miriam looked out at the gray sky, a feeling of unease growing in her chest. You think he's following us? I think he's following Lucy. Lucy heard her name and stepped forward, taking Miriam's hand, her face changing as if she had just heard a wolf howling near the door. Jonas hugged her, and this time Lucy did not back away as before. She let him hold her but kept her tiny hand in Miriam's, as if to share her fear. That evening the storm abated, no longer howling but noticeably colder. Miriam and Jonas sat by the fire, and Lucy lay asleep in the chair with her doll in her arms. The fire warmed the room but did nothing to ease the growing tension in the air. Jonas spoke softly, his voice as deep as the winter earth. I remember someone who came to this ranch before. A summer worker. His name was Hector Mills. Miriam leaned in, paying closer attention. You think he had something to do with the night Evelyn disappeared? Jonas frowned. I'm not sure, but he disappeared from town soon after. No one has seen him since. Do you have reason to doubt him? Jonas was silent. After a moment he answered. He looked at Evelyn in a way I didn't like, but I have no proof, and I was too drunk to remember what happened. Miriam put down her teacup and said softly but clearly, Jonas, I think Evelyn was taken away. She didn't leave the house on her own. Jonas's reaction was quick. He looked at her, his eyes a mixture of pain and hope. Why do you believe that? Because Lucy, Miriam said firmly. A child doesn't think of such details. She remembers. Jonas leaned back in his chair. His breath shook slightly. If that's true, I've been blaming myself for 2 years. Miriam whispered, her voice soft as a woolen blanket. No one deserves to live like that, Jonas. Around midnight, when everything was quiet, Miriam woke up involuntarily. Not because of any loud noise, but because of a slight feeling of unease that crept through the air. She heard a faint sound like the sound of stepping on snow, slow, very slow. Miriam sat up gently and walked to the door. She opened it and stepped into the dark hallway. The fire in the fireplace downstairs was still flickering enough to illuminate part of the stairs. Lucy was standing at the top of the stairs. Miriam startled. "Lucy, why aren't you asleep?" Lucy put her finger to her lips, signaling silence. Then she wrote quickly on a piece of paper on the small table by the stairs, "There's a noise in the attic again." Miriam felt her blood run cold. "Are you sure?" Lucy nodded, strong and afraid. Jonas had just emerged from his room, his eyes still dark. "What happened?" Miriam handed him the piece of paper. Jonas immediately got the lamp. "Stay with Lucy. I'll go upstairs." Miriam stepped up. "I'm coming." Jonas was about to protest, but seeing Lucy trembling with fear, he just nodded. "Get behind me." They climbed the steps. The wooden floorboards creaked under their feet. When they reached the attic door, Jonas unlocked the latch and held up the light. A cold wind blew hard against their faces. The small attic window, which Jonas had boarded up 2 days before, was now ajar. Jonas went in first. There was no one. But in the middle of the floor, it was a pale blue woolen scarf. Evelyn's scarf laid neatly as if someone had left it there on purpose. Miriam looked at Jonas. He stood motionless. His shoulders shook slightly. A tall man, suddenly lost as a child. "Evelyn never leaves the house without this shawl," Jonas said hoarsely. No one knows it but me and the child." Miriam didn't dare breathe loudly. Someone had put the towel there on purpose. Not Evelyn, but someone who wanted to awaken the pain of this family. "Jonas, he's playing a game with you." "No," Jonas said, his eyes sharp. "He's not after me. He's after Lucy." A cold wind crept through the open window, brushed Miriam's cheek and drifted down the stairs, a sign that peace had officially left Silver Creek Ranch for the night. As they went downstairs, Lucy ran to Miriam and hugged her like a kitten facing wolves outside the door. Jonas knelt down and held his daughter close, placing his hand on her head. "No one is going to hurt you," he said, his voice as deep and steady as bedrock. "I promise." Lucy buried her face in his shoulder, her whole body shaking slightly but not crying. The fear was too deep to turn into tears. Miriam stood nearby, watching the embrace, her heart aching. No one deserved such pain. Not a child. Not a man who had lost so much. And not a woman like Evelyn, though she was no longer here to say more. Miriam put her hand on Jonas's back, a small gesture but one that carried strong support. "Jonas, starting tomorrow morning we need to figure things out from the beginning. We can't let him destroy this family again." Jonas looked up at her. "Are you sure this is dangerous?" Miriam replied, her voice firm and unwavering. "I have lived my whole life running from pain. Not anymore. Not when Lucy needs me." Lucy heard her voice and raised her head, her eyes filled with a trust Miriam had never seen in anyone. The girl wrote on the paper again, "I trust you. I trust you too. We are together." Miriam finished reading and nodded slightly. Outside, the storm had died down, but the eerie silence was all the more terrifying. It was as if the land were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that moment, all three of them understood clearly: the past has started knocking. And this time it doesn't wait for anyone to open the door. The next morning opened with an unusual Montana stillness. No wind howled, no roof shakes as storms rolled through. Instead, a silence lay thick and long, like a white blanket draped over Silver Creek Ranch. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was like the moment between heartbeats, when the soul paused to wait for something to happen. Miriam went down to the kitchen earlier than usual. She relit the fire and poured some coffee from the still-hot pot onto the stove. The steam rose gently, but she felt cold inside. The image of the blue scarf in the attic kept coming back to her. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had put it there on purpose to stir up pain, to threaten. Lucy's door opened slightly. She stepped out, her eyes still heavy with fatigue from a night of interrupted sleep. When she saw Miriam, her face relaxed. Lucy walked quickly over and took Miriam's hand. "Are you all right, Lucy?" Miriam asked, her voice soft as she placed her hand on the wound. Lucy said nothing, just leaned her head against her. And Miriam understood her silence was not meaningless. It was a special language deeper than words. Jonas came down next. He walked into the kitchen, a large man, but looking as if he had been through a long battle with himself. His eyes were dark from sleeplessness and from awakened memories. He sat down in a chair. "Today," Jonas said, his voice low, "I want to speak with Sheriff Dalton." Miriam looked at him surprised. "You believe he will help?" "No," Jonas replied bluntly. "But I need the old investigation file on Evelyn." For the first time since Miriam's arrival, she saw a new strength in Jonas, not stubbornness, but the determination of a man who wanted to protect his family at all costs. After a simple breakfast, Jonas prepared the horses. Lucy stood by the door holding Miriam's hand, refusing to let go. She was afraid her father would leave the house. Miriam bent down and hugged her. "Your father will come back," she whispered. "He is stronger than you think." Lucy looked up, her dark brown eyes filled with tears. She wrote on the paper, "Are you here with me?" "I'm not going anywhere," Miriam replied. "I'm staying here. Until everything is clear." Lucy nodded a little bolder. Miriam opened the door to let Jonas out. The snow shone in the new sunlight, blindingly white. Jonas put his foot on the pedal and turned to look at them. "If anything goes wrong, take Lucy down to the basement. Don't wait for me." Miriam nodded. "Be careful." Jonas tightened his grip on the reins. "I won't let the same thing happen again." Then he ran away through the thin snow, his figure gradually blending into the white field. While they waited, Miriam and Lucy cleaned the house. Not to work, but to clear their minds of the worries that plagued them. Lucy swept the floor, her movements gentle but careful, as if every corner held a memory worth preserving. While cleaning the living room, Miriam discovered a small wooden box that had fallen behind a cupboard, perhaps dropped by the wind or by someone accidentally. She picked it up. The box was locked, but not too securely. Lucy approached, her eyes lighting up when she saw it. "You know this box?" Miriam asked. Lucy hesitated, then nodded. She placed her hand on the lid of the box, stroking it gently as if touching something more than an object. Miriam opened it gently, and the old lock popped open easily. Inside was times a few letters. Asterisk, a small silver necklace. Asterisk, and a yellowed photograph of a young Evelyn. But what caught Miriam's eye was an unopened letter lying at the bottom. Sender HMH. M. Hector Mills. Miriam looked at Lucy. "Lucy, have you seen me with this letter before?" Lucy wrote shakily on the paper. "I see him. He is bad. I don't like him. What did he do to my mother?" Lucy clutched her collar. Writing very slowly, he pulled my hand. I said no. I was scared. Miriam's heart skipped a beat when she heard this. This matched the suspicion Jonas had harbored for the past 2 years, a suspicion he had never dared to voice. Lucy looked at Miriam with pleading eyes. "I don't want to remember anymore," she wrote, then crawled into her lap. Miriam hugged her tightly. "It's okay. Just remember what you want. Not everything." But it was then that Miriam understood that the truth of the night Evelyn disappeared was not as vague as it seemed. Lucy's fear was real. The figure in her drawing was real. The door to the past has been opened, and it cannot be closed again. Around noon, the sound of horse hooves was heard outside. Lucy, startled, ran to the window and held Miriam's hand tightly. Not a horse, but 2. Jonas dismounted first. Sheriff Dalton followed. As soon as he saw Lucy, Dalton gave a wry smile. "Hello, kid. Long time no see." Lucy immediately hid behind Miriam, which didn't surprise Dalton. Jonas entered the house first. Dalton followed, untangling his snow-covered scarf. "Tell me," Jonas, Dalton said, "what is so urgent that you have pulled me out of my office in the middle of a storm?" Jonas pointed to the wooden box Miriam had placed on the table. "Explain this to me." Dalton looked frowning at the letter from Hector Mills. "He sent this to Evelyn before. It happened. I knew he disappeared the night after Evelyn disappeared." Jonas replied, his voice as sharp as a knife. "And I never got around to investigating." Dalton sighed, lifting his hat to the table. "Jonas, I understand your pain, but there is no proof. No one saw Mills near the ranch that night." Miriam stepped forward. "But Lucy saw." She remembered. Dalton looked at Lucy, then bent down next to her. "Lucy, what did you see that night?" Lucy huddled against Miriam, her tiny shoulders shaking. She didn't speak. She didn't write. She didn't even look at Dalton. Dalton stood up, sighing. "She's more afraid of me than of the storm." Jonas looked at him, his voice tight. "Because you ignored her from the beginning." Dalton frowned. "I can't rely on the words of a shocked child." But now she remembers, said Miriam. And we found Evelyn's shawl in the attic last night. Dalton turned to Jonas. The attic, I thought you locked it up after Evelyn disappeared. Yes, Jonas replied. But someone got in. Dalton was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Jonas, are you sure no one else has a key to the house? Jonas looked at Miriam. Just me. And Evelyn before. Dalton crossed his arms, his eyes turning serious. If someone took Evelyn's scarf and left it in the attic, Miriam completed the sentence. Then he came into the house while we were sleeping. Hearing this, Lucy gripped Miriam's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Dalton nodded. Jonas, this goes beyond a missing person case. Jonas took a deep breath. So what do we do now? Dalton looked at them, his eyes suddenly serious. Let's go find Hector Mills before he comes back to the ranch. That sentence made the air in the room freeze like the ice outside the window. Miriam hugged Lucy, her voice low but strong. We won't let him near her again. Outside, the snow fell slowly and steadily like the breath of a land keeping old secrets under the ice. But in this house, a journey has officially begun. No more hiding. No more waiting. Just the truth and a fragile family to protect. That afternoon, the sky was still thick and cloudy, as if Montana were trying to keep a secret deep under the cold earth. Miriam stood by the window watching Sheriff Dalton and Jonas confer in the yard. Lucy sat in the wooden chair near the fireplace, her legs swinging slightly but her eyes still haunted by the fear of the night before. The wind gently touched the door like a cold finger brushing across the mirror. Miriam pulled a thick blanket over Lucy. She looked up and wrote on the paper, "Is the policeman good?" Miriam bent down and stroked her hair. "He's trying to help us, but you just have to trust your father. And trust yourself." Lucy nodded slightly, but was still cautious. She did not trust adults easily, especially those who carried the scent of a past she could not reach. Outside, Dalton and Jonas entered the house. Neither looked like men in control, but rather like two men who had just realized the road ahead was long and stormy. "Dalton has news," Jonas said. "Something that will require us to leave this afternoon." Miriam stood up straight. "What news?" Dalton set his hat down on the table and brushed a thin layer of snow from his shoulders. "Hector Mills. Someone saw him at the rest stop west of town last week. No one is sure, but the description matches." Miriam asked, "Is he alone?" Dalton sighed. "They say he left with an old wagon, probably used for hauling stuff. Don't know what he was up to, but he didn't seem too far from the ranch." The air suddenly thickened. Lucy took a small step back and clung to Miriam's sleeve. Jonas looked at her, his face shadowed. "Keep her away from Lucy." Dalton turned to Miriam. "I know you haven't been here long, but you've seen it. We need your sanity. Jonas is in too much pain, and I've let this fall into disrepair." His voice lowered. "I won't let that happen again." Late in the afternoon, the three of them prepared to set out. Miriam donned a heavy coat and tied her hair back to keep the wind out of her face. Jonas checked his harness and pistol, which he carried only in case of emergency. Dalton rummaged in his pocket for an old map marking the location of the rest stop where Mills had been seen. Lucy ran out into the yard to see them off. The newly fallen snow made the ground shine a cold silver. She took Miriam's hand and placed a small piece of paper in her hand. "She protects father and son." The handwriting was crooked but firm, like a message that a child should never have to write. Miriam bent down and held her for a long time. "I promise, and I will come back to you. Nothing will ever separate us." Jonas came closer, placing his hand on Lucy's head. "I'll be back before dark, little girl. You stay in the house, with the door locked." Lucy nodded, but her eyes were still wet. The three of them set off on horseback. The snow crunched under their hooves in a steady crunch. No one spoke for the first few minutes. Each seemed lost in his own thoughts, and they all led back to one name: Hector Mills. The road out of town ran between two ranges of snow-covered land. The sun was hidden behind gray clouds, leaving a faint yellow glow on the horizon. Dalton walked ahead. "Hector worked here for 3 years," he said. "He was quiet and hard-working at first, but then he became strange, arguing with Jonas, looking at Evelyn the wrong way." Jonas frowned, his voice dry. "I chased him away, but it was probably too late." Miriam listened, her heart tightening. "Do you think he came back for Evelyn or for Lucy?" Dalton answered for Jonas. "There are those who do not know how to let go, and when they are removed from their attachment, they become hateful. The three continued walking. The wind grew stronger and the snow began to break into large flakes like rock salt. When they reached the northern stream where the water froze in patches, Jonas suddenly pulled on the reins, signaling a stop. "Wait," he said. "There's something under the ice." Dalton dismounted and knelt beside the stream. He tapped the clear ice with the butt of his gun. Under the ice was a piece of cloth, light blue fabric, the exact same color as the scarf Evelyn used to wear. Dalton shivered slightly. "Oh my God." Miriam jumped down and looked closer. It could just be part of the scarf that got blown here. Jonas shook his head. "Impossible. Evelyn never went to this area. This is a place only Mills used to visit when he was off duty." Dalton stood up, his face tense. "That means he brought the towel here. Or he dragged Evelyn here." A long silence, deep as a stream. The wind was blowing hard. Miriam pulled her coat closer to her, but the cold still penetrated. "We follow the trail," Jonas said. "This leads to the western station." "No," Dalton protested. "We need to be careful. He could be setting a trap." Miriam watched the two men argue. Then she said, calm but hard as winter oak, "Evelyn didn't disappear on her own. The proof is right under our feet. And Lucy is too scared to sleep. If Hector is so scary, he won't stop." Jonas looked at Miriam for a long time. There was more than just trust in his eyes, a recognition that he was no longer alone. Dalton nodded. "Okay, but we'll take it one step at a time." It was getting dark when they reached the station area, a group of old wooden buildings once used by fur traders. No one had lived there in years. The station was dark in the afternoon light, like a giant corpse forgotten by time. Miriam felt something watching her from the shadows. Dalton raised his hand for silence. Jonas drew his gun. The three walked slowly toward the door of the largest house. "The wooden door is unlocked." "This is not normal," Dalton whispered. Jonas knocked lightly on the door. "Who is there?" There was no answer. He pushed the door open. The house was dark, filled with the smell of damp and old ash. But right in the middle of the room was an oil lamp hanging on an old table as if someone had left it just a few minutes ago. And by the lamp is another piece of green cloth. Miriam stopped dead. "It can't be." Jonas took a step forward. "This isn't Evelyn's shawl. This is a piece cut off." Dalton bent down. "There are knife marks. He put it there on purpose." They looked at each other. The air thickened. Miriam said almost silently, "He is leading us." "Yes," Jonas replied, his eyes cold as steel. "Hector Mills wants us to follow him." Dalton turned to them. "And you know what the most dangerous thing is?" Miriam looked at him. Dalton lowered his voice, only a puff of air in the cold air. "We are not the hunters. We are the lures." A back door suddenly creaked. All three turned back at the same time. And at the end of the dark room, a tall, thin, slanted shadow was standing by the back door, then disappear. No footsteps, just a little cold. Miriam squeezed her hand. Jonas loaded the gun. Dalton whispered, "The game has begun." The shadow in the inn did not appear again, but its presence was like an invisible crack running through the room. Miriam stood still, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air was thick as cold ash, and the smell of old burnt wood seemed to permeate every breath. Jonas took a few quick steps toward the back door, but Dalton quickly put up a hand to stop him. "Slow down," he whispered. "He wants us to hurry." Miriam looked through the crack in the door. The woods beyond the station were as dark as a dead forest, only black skeletons standing still in the evening sky. A gentle wind whistled through the pines, making a sound like a whisper, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Dalton turned on the kerosene lamp and tried to see behind the house. The flickering light swept across the ground strewn with twigs and loose rocks. Nothing. No one. Only the snow was disturbed as if someone had run over it. Jonas turned his voice low. "Did you see him clearly?" "No," she said. "I only saw shadows. But I sensed something." She paused, searching for the words. "He didn't run because he was scared. He ran to drag us away." Dalton nodded. "I think so. He's been watching us." Jonas gripped the gun, his knuckles tensing under his leather gloves. "It doesn't matter. Whoever he wants to take, he'll have to face it." Dalton pointed toward the woods. "But we don't know where he is. And it's getting dark." Miriam watched the sky turn waxy purple. Darkness in Montana was like no other. Fast, sharp, and devouring. If they pursued in the darkness, Hector would have an absolute advantage. "Jonas," she whispered, "we should leave before the light goes out completely. This place is not safe to spend the night." Jonas looked around the room one last time. His eyes fell on the half-cut piece of green cloth. It was like a hook digging into his pain, pulling him back 2 years. "Are you going back to the ranch?" Miriam asked softly. Jonas did not answer at once. He bent down and picked up the handkerchief, clutching it tightly. "This is not Evelyn. He is playing with us." Dalton patted Jonas on the shoulder. "We need a clear head. If he took Evelyn away before, he might come back for Lucy." Miriam's chest tightened at that. The image of Lucy, her brown hair, her big eyes that always seemed to embrace the sky, appeared clearly in her mind. A child did not deserve any more fear. "We're going back to the ranch now," she said firmly. Jonas looked at Miriam for a long time, then nodded. "Okay." The road back to the ranch was covered in a thin layer of snow. Moonlight filtered through the thick clouds, illuminating the long, arm-like shadows of the trees stretching to the ground. Jonas rode at the head, Dalton behind, and Miriam held the middle in case of surprises from either side. The wind cut across her face like thin knives, but Miriam sat upright in her saddle, her eyes scanning the road. Years of wandering in the East had not taught her to shoot well, but they had taught her to sense danger before it appeared. After a long silence, Jonas spoke. "Miriam." She looked up. "Yes, I bring you into this too much." Miriam answered immediately, not letting him sink into self-reproach. "I stayed because I wanted to. For Lucy. And for you." Jonas turned to look at her. There was something both strong and tender in his eyes. "You have no idea how hard I've tried to forget. But Lucy, she remembers more than I thought." Miriam pursed her lips. "Children's memories don't disappear. They're just suppressed. And sometimes they come back when we're too weak to fight them off." Dalton interjected, his voice low. "We will not leave her alone. We will not let anything else happen." Jonas nodded. "Whoever he is, whatever he thinks he has." Miriam looked at the road ahead. The snow was softening. The wind had erased the horse tracks. Everything was so white that it was impossible to tell where the road was and where the ground lay. But Silver Creek Ranch is nearby. She felt it intuitively, as if the place had become her home without her knowing. As they reached the halfway point, Miriam suddenly pulled on the reins. "Wait." Jonas turned around at once. "What's wrong, do you hear?" The wind blew across the meadow. Dalton was silent, head tilted. In that long silence, there was a very small sound. So small it sounded like tiny feet running across the thin snow. Jonas turned pale. "No, no way." Miriam rode ahead. Dalton followed. Jonas rode fastest, his heart tearing from his chest. Before reaching the top of the hill, the three saw. A small figure was running through the snow, its legs stumbling and then getting up trembling towards them. Lucy. The world seemed to freeze in that moment. "Lucy," Jonas shouted, his voice breaking. The girl turned her head, her breathing ragged, her eyes panicked as if she was running away from an invisible wolf. Miriam jumped off the horse before it had even stopped and ran to hug the child. "Lucy." "Oh my. Why did you go out?" Lucy trembled and held out the crumpled piece of paper. Someone knocked at the door. I hid under the table. I heard footsteps upstairs. I thought they were looking for me. Jonas felt his whole body freeze. He got into the ranch. Dalton gripped the gun so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If he can get into the ranch while we're gone, he'll come back." Lucy hiccuped softly in Miriam's arms. She held her close as if to ward off the cold wind and all her fear. "It's okay, Lucy," Miriam said, her voice soft as a candle in the darkness. "I'm here. Your father is here." Lucy squeezed Miriam's hand. But when she looked up, Miriam saw that the fear was not just from what had just happened. The girl wrote another line, each stroke trembling. "I heard someone calling my name." Dalton nodded slightly. "Hector has really returned." Jonas stood there, his eyes dark, unreachable. "No," he said hoarsely. "Not just back." He looked at Miriam. Then, at his daughter. "He is coming to finish what he started." The wind blew stronger, like a long howl from the distant mountains, and Miriam understood. Lucy's fear is no longer a memory. It was out there, in the dark pines, in the gathering darkness, and it was coming towards them. The Montana night air carried a strange chill, like the breath of an invisible mouth. that groped around the edge of the ranch. Miriam held Lucy to her chest, keeping her warm and trying to calm herself. Jonas stood beside her gun, clutched his gaze, scanning the hillside. Dalton circled around behind, checking for footprints. The sky was turning purple and the last light was receding from the land as if the sun itself was afraid of the falling darkness. Jonas spoke first. "We need to get her back to the ranch. It's more dangerous out here." Miriam nodded, pulling Lucy close. "Lucy, listen to me," she said in a voice as soft but firm as braided rope. "Hold on to me. We're going home." Lucy nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground as if afraid the darkness would jump up and swallow her at any moment. The three mounted. Jonas carried Lucy in front, Miriam riding close behind. Dalton rode at the rear, keeping an eye out in all directions. The road back to the ranch wasn't far, but each stretch seemed twice as long because everyone knew Hector was somewhere nearby, maybe just a forest away or just a breath of wind. As they approached the ranch, Jonas stopped his horse abruptly. "Wait." Miriam tightened her grip on the reins. "What's the matter, Jonas?" Pointed up the eastern slope. "What do you see?" Miriam squinted. On top of the snow-covered slope stood a figure, tall, thin, and leaning like a withered tree in winter. A figure that did not belong here, nor did it belong in peace. Lucy shivered, burying her face in Jonas's shoulder. Dalton lowered his voice, cold as the night dew. "It's him." But it wasn't the figure that made Miriam shiver. It was the way he stood. Not moving, not hiding, not running. "He is waiting for them." "He wanted me to see," Jonas said softly. "He wanted me to know he was standing right here, closer to the ranch than we thought." Dalton pulled out his gun. "You want me to fire a warning shot?" Miriam shook her head immediately. "No. If he wants to play this game, we can't let him guess what we're going to do. Getting agitated now will ruin everything." Jonas looked at Miriam for a long time. "What do you think he will do next?" Miriam replied, her voice soft but sharp. "He wants to drag us back into fear, and he knows the best way to do that is to stand where Evelyn stood on the last day." Jonas swallowed hard. She saw his hands grip the reins so tightly that his knuckles were white. I remember her standing there. Late winter. Evelyn loved to watch the sunset from there. And Hector knew," said Miriam. "That's why he chose that spot." Dalton growled. "Psychological. He wants Jonas to collapse." Jonas looked at the figure on the hill. "No. He wants me to remember what I have forgotten." The figure slowly retreated into the shadows of the forest, not running, not in a hurry, as if he knew very well that they would not dare to pursue while still carrying the child. Lucy sobbed softly. "Daddy, will he marry me?" Her voice was as small as the wind. Jonas bent down and kissed her hair. "No. Never. I swear." Miriam placed her hand on his as if to give him strength. "No one can take her away from us." Night fell, and they returned to the ranch. Silver Creek Ranch appeared warm and vulnerable in the light of the oil lamps in the windows. Miriam dismounted, first walked quickly to the door, opened it, pulled Lucy inside, and locked it. Jonas and Dalton circled the house, checking every entrance. No doors had been broken into. There was no sign of re-entry, but Hector's presence still hung like a thin layer of smoke. Lucy sat, huddled in the rocking chair, hugging her doll. Miriam lit more wood, the firelight, making her face a little pink. Jonas sat facing the fireplace, his eyes fixed on his daughter. Dalton stood near the door like a sentinel. "We need a plan," Dalton said, his voice echoing softly in the wooden room. Jonas asked softly, "What do you want to do?" "Set a trap," Dalton replied. "Use the same spot he chose as bait. He's testing me. I'll show him I'm not afraid." Jonas looked at Miriam as if waiting for her opinion. Miriam nodded slightly. "Hector wants to control our fear. But the truth is, he has already shown his weakness." Jonas tilted his head. "What weakness?" "He can't move away from the spot where Evelyn once stood. He's haunted." Miriam spoke slowly, each word falling like creaking wood. "He thinks Evelyn is his. He thinks Lucy is what's left of it too." Lucy heard her name, her hands squeezed the doll until her fingers turned white. Jonas growled softly, "No. No one has that right." Miriam placed her hands on the table, her voice small but cold as steel. "Then we will do what he does not expect." Dalton frowned. "What are your plans?" Miriam took a deep breath. "Let me talk to him." Jonas jumped up immediately. No, absolutely not. Miriam remained calm. I didn't say I was going alone. I'm not stupid. But Hector wants to see me. He knows I'm the only one Lucy trusts. He knows I'm the only one who can calm her fears. Dalton stepped closer. You think he's obsessed with you? Not a sick obsession, Miriam replied. A dangerous obsession. He sees me as Evelyn's replacement, and he wants to destroy that. Jonas sat down, his hands clasped together, pain and anger intertwined. You're putting yourself in the wolf's mouth. Miriam replied softly, Jonas, I have lived long enough to know when to be afraid. And this time, I am not afraid. Not because I am brave, but because of Lucy. Lucy looked at Miriam, her eyes shining with trust. She stepped forward and placed her tiny hand on Miriam's. Don't go alone, she wrote quickly. Miriam hugged her. I will never go alone, Lucy. But we must be strong. For Evelyn. Jonas looked at the two of them, his eyes widening, not with anger, but with a deeper emotion, as if he were seeing the rebirth of something he thought long lost. Dalton spoke up, his voice firm. Okay, we will create a plan to lure him out. When Jonas asked. Tomorrow night, Dalton replied. On the hill where he stands. Miriam felt a chill run down her spine, but she did not back down. Then, let's start preparing. After Lucy fell asleep, Miriam sat by the fire. Jonas came and sat beside him, the firelight falling on his face, drawing deep, dark lines. Are you sure? Jonas asked, his voice soft, unlike the one he had heard in the face of danger. Yes, Miriam said. I must. Hector is not afraid of guns, but he will be afraid of the truth. Jonas looked into the fire. I don't want to lose anyone else. Miriam looked at him slow and deep. You will not lose me. I have been swept away too many times. This time I choose to stay. Jonas looked up, his eyes holding both winter and the brightness of spring. You don't know what that means. Yes, Miriam replied softly. Because I was alone. For a long time. Jonas did not answer. He simply reached out and placed his hand on Miriam's, a small gesture, but enough to say that the silence between them no longer carried the weight of loneliness. Miriam, let it be. For once, she did not pull her hand away. Outside, the wind still howled softly, like the echoes of old souls wandering the woods. But in that small wooden house, something new was taking shape. Something Hector could not break. Not by fear. Not by the past. Not by darkness. Miriam looked out the window where the hilltop was shrouded in night mist. Tomorrow the truth will be dragged out of the darkness, and Hector will have to face it. Not just with Jonas. Not just with Dalton. But with the very thing he feared most. The resurrection of those he thought had fallen. That night, Silver Creek Ranch barely slept. Even the wind seemed to be preparing for something the world could not foresee. Miriam sat alone at the wooden table, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp illuminating her thoughtful face. Jonas and Dalton were talking on the porch, their voices low and taut as bowstrings. Lucy was asleep, curled up in the thick blanket, her steady breathing a fragile bridge to what little peace she had left. A few strands of her hair fell on the pillow, and Miriam stroked them gently, a small act filled with unspoken worry. She looked toward the fire in the fireplace. It was burning brightly, but inside her there was something else burning even more. Tomorrow they would go up the eastern hill. Tomorrow Hector would appear. And tomorrow it would all be over somehow. On one side is truth. On the other side is fear. And in the middle is a family as fragile as cracked glass. Jonas entered the house, his boots caked with snow. He looked at Miriam a long time, as if trying to find the right words. Dalton came in behind him, his scarf pulled tight around his neck, his face as stony as a mountain. Miriam, Jonas said, we want to hear your opinion again. One last time. His voice was not doubtful, but rather a silent plea. Miriam stood up, her eyes straight. I won't change my mind. Hector wants to face me because he thinks I'm weak. But that's his weakness. Dalton crossed his arms. You stay in the middle while Jonas and I hide in the shade. He'll think you're alone. The eastern hilltop, Jonas continued, is where he believes he has control. But that's why. That's where we'll turn the tide. Miriam nodded, but then she continued, her voice very soft. What about Lucy? Both men were silent. So silent that the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth, like metal rubbing against metal. Finally, Jonas said, you don't have to worry about her. I swear with everything that's left of my life, that I will protect her. Miriam looked into his eyes, tired but bright, hurt but determined, as if seeing 2 years of his torment wrapped up in a promise. She nodded. I believe you. The storm began to lift near dawn. A thin layer of mist clung to everything, making the trees along the road look like landmarks leading into another world. Miriam donned her thickest cloak, tied her scarf tightly, and checked her steps like someone who knew she was going into battle. Lucy walked out of the room just as Miriam was buttoning the last button of her blouse. The little girl walked barefoot on the carpet, her eyes both sleepy and worried. She took Miriam's hand and wrote on a piece of paper, I have to go back to you. Miriam's heart sank. She knelt down to eye level with the girl. I'll come back. I promise. Whatever happens, Lucy, you'll never be left behind. Lucy squeezed her hand, then slowly leaned her head on Miriam's shoulder as if wanting to retain that warmth before she left the house. Jonas stood in the doorway watching the scene, his eyes clouded with something deeper than words. Dalton cleared his throat, then spoke with his usual firmness. It's time. They set out as the sun crept over the distant mountains. Its weak light filtered through the mist, making it seem as if the world were breathing its last cold breath before waking. The eastern hills were still covered with a thick blanket of snow. The old pine trees stood in rows, tall and silent. The space was vast but stuffy, as if someone had taken away the warmest air. Dalton signaled a stop at the top of the small bluff below the hill. Jonas and he led the horses into the shade of the trees. Jonas set his hand on her shoulder, strong and warm. I'm always right here. Miriam looked at him. I know. She stepped out into the open space. The space was so vast, she could hear the snow crunching under her feet. A gentle breeze brushed her neck like a cold hand. Miriam stood where Evelyn had stood, where Hector had stood the night before, where the shadow on the hill had made Lucy shiver. She took a deep breath. Okay, she said under her breath. I'm here. At first there was nothing. No footsteps, no branches breaking. Just the wind in her ears and the slow beat of her heart. Then, as if an invisible string was gently pulled, there was the sound of dry branches breaking. Miriam straightened her back. Her eyes scanned the woods. Jonas in the shadows could see the tension in Hector's muscles if he were watching them. Footsteps appeared, slow, steady, dragging, like the sound of a wind carrying the scent of a rotting forest. A figure stepped out of the pines, tall, thin, and hazy in the mist. Hector Mills. His hair was long and tangled, his face thin as if worn by wind and time. His leather jacket was worn to the point of being torn at the shoulders, and his eyes were an inhuman black. He looked at Miriam with a look that seemed to search her for her old self. He took another step forward, and smiled a crooked smile that chilled Miriam's flesh. Evelyn, he said. His voice was hoarse like a stone grinding against steel. So, you still came back to me. Miriam did not back down. I am not Evelyn. Hector tilted his head as if he didn't understand. His voice was so soft it was frightening. A lost woman. A child who needs me. An unworthy man. All the same as before. He stepped closer. Jonas gripped his gun in the shade of the trees. Dalton signaled to wait. Miriam said, her voice calm but hard as stone. Hector, Evelyn didn't choose you. She never did. His smile faded immediately, as if someone had just turned off a light. Hector moved straight toward her. I know her. I understand her better than anyone. She looked at me with those eyes. That light. Evelyn belongs to me, not Jonas. You dragged her away, Miriam said slowly. That night, you dragged her up the hill. Lucy saw. Hector stopped, stunned. Then his face twisted like an out-of-control tornado. She must not be seen. She must not be remembered, he screamed. That scream made the birds in the forest take flight. Miriam kept her composure. Hector, stop. It's over. No, it's not over, he gasped. If Evelyn isn't here, then you're the one taking her place. Lucy will. The gun went off. Jonas stepped out of the shadow of the tree like a shadow of steel. Try touching her. Hector stood still. Dalton stepped out too, gun pointed. Hector Mills. Stop. Hector looked at Miriam, then at Jonas, then at the woods behind where he had been hiding. He trembled slightly. Not because of fear, but because the past caught up with him. In a split second, Miriam realized this was the moment he revealed himself for who he really was. Not the invisible monster, but the broken person who clung to illusion to hide his sins. Hector. Miriam said again, her voice as soft as the scarf Evelyn had worn. Put it down. Hector looked at his hand. It was shaking. He took a step back. 2. Then his eyes changed like someone about to jump into flames. He lunged at Miriam. Dalton yelled. Jonas raised his gun. But Miriam, she stood still. Because she knew if she ran, Lucy would run forever. If she backed away, Jonas would live in the darkness forever. If she feared, Hector would win, and she wouldn't let that happen. The moment Hector lunged toward Miriam, everything seemed suspended in space. The wind stopped. The forest fell silent. All that remained was the image of a haunted man running in despair and a woman standing firm as a beacon of destiny. Jonas fired just as Hector was within arm's length of Miriam. The shot rang out sharp and piercing as if it had split the hillside. Hector stopped, his hands open, his eyes vacant like someone who had just dropped the last illusion he clung to. He looked down at his chest where blood was beginning to spread in red patches across his frayed jacket. Miriam took a step back, not out of fear but out of the heavy feeling that came from the collapse of a soul that had long strayed from the right path. Hector looked up at Miriam. He tried to reach out but could not reach. He breathed softly, a breath like wind through rotten wood. Evelyn, it's not my fault. Hector's last words fell to the cold ground like a piece of ash, light and useless. Dalton ran forward, grabbing Hector's shoulder, but within seconds his body went limp. Hector Mills was dead. Jonas stood still, his gun drooping at his side, his breathing heavy as if he had just emerged from a storm filled not only with wind and snow but also with darkness and torment. Miriam turned to look at him. His eyes were moist but no longer clouded as they had been for the past 2 years. Dalton put his hand on Jonas's shoulder. I have no choice. Jonas did not answer. He only looked at Hector as if at a memory locked in his chest from the night Evelyn disappeared. They buried Hector under a large pine near the foot of the hill where the wind blew gently, where the snow lay soft as a last blanket for a lost man. Dalton placed a pine branch on the makeshift grave, then stood up and spoke in a low voice. That's all he got, and all he could take with him. No one said another word. Miriam looked at the hill where it all ended. There was no honor in Hector's death, no hatred, only a strange relief. Not for Hector, but for the one who survived what he had done. For Jonas, for Lucy, and a little for Evelyn. As the evening wore on, they returned to the ranch. Silver Creek loomed with warm yellow light from the windows like arms waiting for those returning from a long and challenging journey. Lucy ran from the porch, her eyes filled with terror when she saw Jonas with blood on his shirt. Dad, are you hurt? The child wrote on the paper almost immediately. Jonas knelt down and held her close, his breath shaky but his voice steady as a rock. I'm okay. It's over. Lucy. Lucy looked at Miriam as if waiting for confirmation. Miriam nodded, her smile small but meaningful. It's okay. No one can hurt you anymore. Lucy threw herself into Miriam's arms, choking but not crying. It was the first time Miriam felt like she belonged here among the people quietly rebuilding their lives from broken pieces. In the evening, Jonas sat by the fire with Dalton. Miriam made hot tea and set it before them. Dalton looked at them both and said, I will make a full report. Hector's death must be properly recorded. Jonas, you have nothing more to fear. Jonas was silent for a long moment, then he said slowly, I blamed myself for 2 years. I think, even though I don't remember, it was still my fault. Dalton put a hand on his shoulder. No. Hector dragged Evelyn away, and she was trying to protect Lucy. It wasn't your fault. Miriam added, her voice warm and deep. Jonas, sometimes suffering makes one think that one is the source of all tragedy. But the truth is that there is a limit to what one can endure. It is not your fault for surviving. Jonas's eyes wavered. He looked into the fire, taking a deep breath for the first time in months. Thank you, he whispered to Miriam, to Dalton, and to himself. Dalton stood up. I'll report back. Come back tomorrow. You two. Get some rest. And Jonas, he paused at the door. You have a family that needs you. Don't miss that. Jonas nodded. Thank you, Dalton. The door closed, leaving the house with only 3 people. Lucy sat in the rocking chair, holding the doll whose left arm was torn off. Miriam came over to her and stroked her hair. Are you okay? Lucy wrote in small but decisive handwriting. Is Mother Evelyn safe? Miriam choked. Jonas knelt beside her, his voice echoing in the quiet house like the notes of an old dobro. Yes, my child. Your mother is at peace." Lucy placed her tiny hand on Jonas's chest, right where his heart lay, as if she were putting down a pain to support him. Late that night, after Lucy had fallen asleep, Miriam stood on the porch. The new moon cast a gossamer light over the snow. Jonas emerged a few minutes later, 2 mugs of hot tea in his hands. He handed a cup to Miriam. "I don't know how to thank you." Miriam smiled slightly, not turning her head. "You don't need to thank me. I'm not doing this out of obligation." Jonas was silent for a moment. Then he said something Miriam did not expect. "I was afraid of losing you." She turned the moonlight reflecting in his eyes, eyes that had been through too many winters but were now finding their way to spring. "Jonas, I'm scared too. But not of you. I'm scared that I'll leave again. Like I've done all my life." He stepped closer. "You don't have to leave. Not this time." Miriam lowered her eyes. "I used to think I wasn't enough to stay with anyone. I had no children, no home, nothing." Jonas placed his hand on hers, a slow, steady gesture, not forcing but waiting for her heart's consent. "Miriam, you are home to her. And to me. We need you. Not because you replace Evelyn, but because you are you." Miriam felt as if the wind had melted the ice in her heart. She said nothing, just let her hand rest in his, something she had never allowed anyone to do before. And as if sensing it, Jonas said softly, "Or you stay with us." Miriam looked at him for the first time, her eyes unguarded. "Jonas, I will stay." He didn't hug her. He didn't kiss her. He just held her hand tighter, the way Western men do when they promise something with their lives. The next morning, as the sun bathed the entire Silver Creek Ranch in gold, Lucy ran down the stairs with a small but genuine smile, a smile Miriam hadn't seen since the day she arrived. The child showed him a new drawing, 3 people holding hands, a small house under a blue sky, a little girl standing in the middle smiling, and the small print below, "Family." Miriam took the child in her arms. Jonas stood behind them, his hands on both their backs like pillars of support. And in that moment, in a cabin in the middle of vast Montana, Miriam Carter understood she had not been called to this place by mistake, but by a gentle stroke of fate, a whisper like a gentle breeze. "God finally sent you to us." And this time she believed it. The stories of Miriam, Jonas, and Lucy remind us, especially those of us who are already past our prime, that it is never too late to find peace. Some wounds linger into old age, not because they never heal, but because we have never met the right person to touch them with kindness. Love sometimes comes not from wholeness but from broken hearts, but still brave enough to open up again. And silence, especially in children or those who have suffered, is not weakness, but a form of resistance requiring the deepest understanding. If this story reminds you of things you've lost, people you've loved, or opportunities you've missed, know this healing can begin at any age. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of the story. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that I can continue to send you stories that touch your heart.